Sansa Stark stood on the cold stone floor of the Red Keep's throne room, trembling as she replayed the moment of her father's execution again and again in her mind. One by one, the gathered lords and ladies had cheered or gasped or wept, but the memory of the crowd's roar receded against the starker recollection of Ned Stark's final look, one of profound sadness. He had not been afraid, no, not her noble father, but the heartbreak lingered in his eyes as the sword fell. She had never before truly known what hatred tasted like, but it filled her mouth now, turning every meal into ash. She swallowed it each day along with her fear, praying to the old gods or the new, anything that might deliver her from the suffocating captivity of King's Landing. Yet in the dark of each night, the resentment and anger grew into something else, like a wolf stirring in her chest. Vengeance coiled around her grief, forging a single directive she repeated to herself in secret. They all had to pay. In the weeks following Ned's death, she remained outwardly docile, learning quickly that her survival hinged on keeping her head bowed. King Joffrey Baratheon, newly ascended to the Iron Throne, took every opportunity to torment her. Sometimes it was a sting of words, other times a command to strip before the Kingsguard so he could revel in her humiliation. Though one or two knights sometimes chose to avert their eyes, she found a friend in none of them. At Joffrey's command, she was forced to look at her father's head as it rotted on its spike. She had nearly collapsed from horror and grief, but something within her refused to buckle that day. Instead, she channeled her revulsion inward, turning it into quiet resolve. She started to understand that if she let them see her tears, they would be satisfied. And if they were satisfied, they would allow her to live, at least long enough for her to do something about it. Her life became an exercise in masking her true thoughts. Behind her lowered gaze, Sansa watched and listened. She noticed the steps in the corridor, the patrol schedules of the gold cloaks, and which doors were left unlocked in the late hours. She observed Joffrey's favored routes through the castle, learned which hidden corners the maids used to gossip. She began memorizing names, those who served the Queen Regent, those sworn to Tywin Lannister now that he served as Hand of the King. She did nothing overt that would draw attention, for fear of being recognized as a threat. But each day she built an arsenal of knowledge. No one suspected her of harboring grand designs, not sweet, delicate Sansa Stark, who had once swooned at the idea of tourneys and knights, who had yearned to be Joffrey's queen. That fantasy had burned in the moment the sword touched Ned Stark's neck. All that remained of it was a keen sense that her rightful place was not as a prisoner or a plaything. She had the blood of wolves in her. She would bide her time, yes, but the time would come. Her opportunity arrived more swiftly than she had dared hope. The war was not going well for the Lannisters. Robb Stark was winning battles in the field, capturing Jaime Lannister, and forging alliances that threatened the hold Tywin had on the realm. The older Lannister lord eventually marched his army close to the capital to keep a watchful eye, which placed Tywin under the same roof as Joffrey. Sansa found it grimly fitting that two of the men most responsible for her father's downfall would be sleeping in the same place, though she had no illusions that they would be easy to strike. Tywin was surrounded by guards and had an aura that commanded respect and fear. Joffrey, of course, was king, with his Kingsguard about him at nearly all hours. But it also meant they occasionally gathered in the same hall, the same solar, or even the same feast. If they could ever be made vulnerable, it would be in those settings where their pride was at its peak. Vengeance in one strike, the thought seemed nearly impossible. Yet each night before she closed her eyes, she imagined herself taking that impossibility and bending it to her will. She remembered the little lessons her father had given her, though they had mostly been overshadowed by Arya's training. Ned Stark had never been able to hide the fact that Sansa's interest lay in songs rather than swords. But now, in her darkest hour, Sansa realized that every daughter of the North possessed a fire that could not be extinguished by the cruelty of southern courts. With no skill in open combat, she planned instead to rely on cunning, on quiet steps and hidden blades. Like a lone wolf, she would strike precisely when the pack's trap had been laid. Unfortunately, she was as alone as one could be. She had no pack here, not even a single friend. The Hound? He was Joffrey's hound, wasn't he? And yet, every so often, She caught a certain pity or quiet empathy in Sandor Clegane's eyes. But no, trusting him might be too great a risk, she told herself. The cost of one misstep could be her life, and she needed her life if she was to do justice for her father. She considered poison. In King's Landing, poisons were as common as knives, or so the whispered rumors went. Quiet, subtle, the preferred weapon of the cowardly or the clever, depending on one's perspective. Sansa thought, would that not be best? If Joffrey were to choke at a feast, or Tywin's soup were just a fraction too bitter one evening. But such an act would only remove one. She doubted she would find a chance to poison both at the same time. Then again, the Red Keep's kitchens served the entire royal household, from the king to his hand, to his queen mother, to the lords and ladies in waiting. If she could manipulate an event that brought them close together, share a dish, a toast, maybe it would be possible. And yet, Sansa understood that to kill them with poison might not make enough of a statement. She wanted them to feel the blade. She wanted Joffrey to look upon the face of his assassin and know it was the daughter of the man he had slain. This sudden thirst for personal retribution startled her. It was a far cry from the gentle, song-loving girl she had been. But that girl was gone, she told herself. Sansa, the Lady of Songs, had died along with her father. She needed help, if not a collaborator, then a resource. Littlefinger eyed her too openly. His interest in her was unsettling, though she sensed he wanted something from her, some misguided echo of his love for her mother. Yet he was cunning beyond measure, and Sansa knew she risked becoming a pawn in his schemes. Lord Varys, the master of whisperers, was equally dangerous, always wearing that innocent smile that belied cunning she could never hope to match. Grand Maester Pycelle, no, he was clearly in the Lannisters' pocket. Ser Dantos was a fool, but once or twice, he'd seemed to commiserate with her sorrow. However, Sansa wasn't sure how far to trust him. All around her stood potential conspirators or watchers, and she was certain that revealing too much to the wrong person would doom her. She decided that if she was to do this, she would do it alone. Her daily routine continued. She rose at dawn, forced to do so by the watchers who escorted her to break her fast. She ate little in the great hall, usually only half-stale bread and a bit of wine, under the wary or mocking gazes of the courtiers. She took her needlework lessons and tried to please Queen Cersei with superficial courtesy. She even pretended to amuse Joffrey when he demanded it, whether by listening to his prattle about how he would put down Robb Stark or how he'd parade Robb's head just like Ned's if the young wolf ever fell into his clutches. Her hatred swelled, but she kept it hidden behind eyes that she forced to remain steady or lowered demurely. When the hour of rest came, she slipped quietly from her chamber, feigning the need for a walk or fresh air. She memorized corners of the keep, noticing nooks and crannies where she might hide. She scoured corridors that led to smaller rooms rarely used, listened at the hush of servants who complained about scullery work or spoke about leftover bread. Gradually, an idea formed in her mind. Tywin Lannister was an impeccable man. He demanded the best. His wines, she heard, were carefully selected. A certain rare arbor gold had arrived from the south just days earlier. Sansa knew Tywin took a glass in the evenings before bed. She had overheard it from a pair of handmaids gossiping about how the new cask had been moved into his solar. Joffrey, for his part, was a child who liked to act the adult, drinking and feasting at all hours. If invited, he would never refuse a chance to show off his new adult status. A plan began to crystallize in Sansa's mind. She needed a moment where the two of them shared the same drink. She needed to be certain they'd both pick up that cup, or at least taste from it. Then she could be free to strike in the chaos. Yes, chaos would be her ally, for she had no illusions that she could stand toe-to-toe with the Kingsguard in open combat. She needed them confused, needed them looking in the wrong direction while she took her shot. That night, she held a candle before her battered mirror and examined her own reflection. The bruises on her arm, faint smudges of exhaustion beneath her eyes. She noticed a sharpened cast to her face she'd never had before. It frightened her, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose. Under the bed's thin mattress, she had hidden a small blade. It was no long sword, only a short, narrow-bladed dagger she had stolen from a servant's belt. She carefully withdrew it, tested the edge, and found it wanting. The castle blacksmith was beyond her reach, but she'd managed to rub the blade against stone in some disused corridor a few nights prior. With each pass over the stone, she had pictured Joffrey's sneering face. She never wanted to kill anyone before, but now she was sure. It had to happen. For her father, for all the cruelty inflicted upon her. Some part of her also feared what would become of her if she failed. Yet that fear only intensified her planning. Days turned to weeks as she waited for the right opportunity. Then, like a gift from the gods, she overheard from a talkative maid that Tywin Lannister had arranged a private tasting of his newly arrived Arbor Gold. The king was to be invited. Cersei would be absent, busy with a meeting among the small council and some visiting envoys. Tywin evidently wished to mold Joffrey further in the ways of kingship without Cersei's constant interference. Lord Varys was rumored to be attending along with Pycelle, though who knew if either truly would. The important detail was that Tywin wanted an intimate gathering, not a large feast with the entire court. He wanted to keep Joffrey close, father him in a way, instruct him in the complexities of the realm's alliances, no doubt. Sansa gleaned that it was set to happen in Lord Tywin's solar 2 evenings hence. She reasoned that fewer people increased her chances, but it also meant more watchful eyes in a smaller space. The tasting would likely happen at a large table with Tywin, Joffrey, perhaps 2 or 3 others, possibly Kevan Lannister, maybe the Master of Coin, Littlefinger, or Pycelle. But the small circle also meant the moment of pouring the wine would be well observed. Poisoning it discreetly would be risky. Still, she began to think about how to sow confusion in that environment. If Tywin were to invite Joffrey to taste from the same bottle, the same decanter, she needed a diversion, something that would draw eyes away just long enough for her to slip poison into the decanter. Yet obtaining poison was a challenge in itself. She recalled overhearing certain old women in the kitchen speak of a substance referred to as tears of Lys or the Strangler, whispered of in the city. She had no way of acquiring them safely. Then there was the House of the Undying Rumor from across the sea, talk of potions sold by Shadowbinders from Ass High. But that was far beyond her reach. Sansa realized time was short and a perfect plan might not exist. Maybe she could switch the wine decanter altogether if she found a way into Tywin's solar beforehand, leaving behind a tampered one, or perhaps a simpler approach. If they both took a cup, she could use those precious seconds to step behind Joffrey, slip her dagger into his neck, and in the uproar, lunge at Tywin. Foolhardy, yes, but she might not have another chance. The day of the tasting, Sansa played her part as usual. A docile, mild creature, drifting around the edges of the court. She carefully noted that Joffrey left the throne room in the late afternoon, presumably to dress for the evening with his grandfather. Sansa had gleaned from the servants that Tywin had chosen his smaller solar on the 3rd level of Maegor's Holdfast. It was an easily secured room, wide windows that looked out on the city. Guards, no doubt, would be posted outside. Sansa suspected that at least one guard or sentinel would be placed in the corridor, and likely another stationed inside the room. She considered how to bypass them. But as afternoon stretched on, she found reason to wander in the general area of Tywin's chosen solar. The corridors were nearly empty. She noticed a side door that led to a small library annex, which in turn had a concealed door connecting to the solar. This was knowledge gleaned from bits of overheard conversation about the keep's old design. If she could hide in that annex before Tywin and Joffrey arrived, she might remain undetected. She changed into a plain gown, one that wouldn't draw attention, dark in color to blend with the shadows. Then she concealed her small blade beneath her skirts, fastening it with a simple piece of cloth so it would not slip. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her face composed. She arrived at the library annex when the hall was quiet. Slipping inside and stepping behind an old shelf, the place smelled of dust and parchment. She waited, every minute making her second-guess the plan. She had no illusions about how dangerous this was, how likely she was to be caught. If she was caught, she would face the same fate as her father or perhaps worse. She forced that thought aside, whispering her father's name like a shield against fear. At length, voices drifted through the door. One was unmistakably Tywin's measured tone, speaking of the realm's finances, the cost of war, and how to manage the recalcitrant lords. Another voice belonged to Joffrey, haughty and petulant. There was some remark about how the Boy King wanted to mount Robb Stark's head on a spike next to Ned's. Sansa's blood boiled. Steady, she told herself. She peeked through a thin crack in the door, seeing part of a wooden table, upon which sat a polished decanter of golden wine and 5 goblets. 5. That meant 3 more people, or perhaps a cup for each plus a spare. To one side, she caught a glimpse of Lord Varys's silken robes. So the spider was here. She couldn't see anyone else yet. She heard Tywin say, "Your Grace, we must always handle the lords of the realm with tact. Fear is a potent weapon, but so is gold. Remember that. Now, shall we taste this arbor vintage? I have been told it is among the finest produced in a generation." Joffrey responded with a self-important sniff. Then footsteps. Sansa edged back. The door opened, and a servant entered the annex to retrieve something. Perhaps a small cask of parchments. Sansa pressed herself against the wall, praying she blended with the darkness. The servant, a young man, rummaged for a moment. Then, to Sansa's horror, he began to approach her side of the annex. She stifled her breath, her hand clenched around the small dagger hidden in her skirts. If he discovered her, she would have to silence him. But that would end everything. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it would echo off the old books. The servant, however, merely took a final glance around, decided the item he sought was not on that shelf, and left. Releasing a silent breath, Sansa let her heart slow. Back in the solar, she heard Tywin's voice again. "Ser Meryn, do stand outside. We do not need you looming while the king and I have a private discussion." That meant Ser Meryn Trant was posted in the corridor, which left who inside the room? Joffrey, Tywin, Lord Varys, presumably. Anyone else? Possibly a cupbearer or a steward. She listened intently. Lord Varys's voice drifted in next. "Your Grace, my lord, might I pour for you both?" Polite murmurs. Perfect. Sansa heard the sound of pouring. She wanted to slip in at that moment, but she needed them distracted. If Varys was pouring, he would have eyes on the decanter. She needed a chance to act. She steadied herself, thinking, "I can wait for them to toast. After they sip, I can rush in from behind. They will be caught off guard." But would she be able to kill them both in one strike? Tywin's voice again. "We shall see if the arbor is as fine as rumor claims. Your Grace, a glass. Lord Varys, join us." Glasses clinked. They must be raising them for a toast. "To victory, and to the furtherance of House Lannister," Tywin said. Joffrey added, "Here, here." Sansa listened to them drink. She would have to move now while their guards were down, both figuratively and literally, in that they held cups rather than weapons. Slowly, she pushed open the hidden door a crack. She saw Tywin at the head of the table, swirling his wine with a discerning sniff. Joffrey perched in a cushioned chair to Tywin's left, wearing a deep crimson doublet, the golden crown slightly askew on his mop of blonde curls. Lord Varys stood to the side with a small smile. No one else. Good. That was one less pair of eyes. She slid through the opening, stepping onto the thick carpet without a sound. The tension made her entire body feel as though it would shake. Still, she eased forward. If she could get close behind Joffrey, her dagger could find his neck easily enough. The Boy King was smaller than her father had been, certainly. But Tywin, how could she ensure he would not cry out or fight back effectively? He was an older man, but formidable in presence and cunning. Could she do it swiftly enough? Then, fate seemed to intervene on her behalf. Outside, there was a sudden outcry in the hallway, footsteps pounding. Ser Meryn's voice snapped. "What are you doing here, boy?" Another voice, muffled and high-pitched, responded in alarm. A scuffle of some kind. Tywin turned his head, frowning. Joffrey leapt up from his chair, sloshing wine over the carpet. Lord Varys's eyes darted to the door. For a heartbeat, all of them were focused on the noise outside. It was the perfect diversion. Sansa drew her dagger and in 2 swift steps stood behind Joffrey. She grabbed a handful of his golden hair and yanked his head back. Before he could so much as release a squeak, she drove the blade into his throat. She felt a momentary jolt of shock pass through her at the sensation, but her hand remained steady. Blood spurted, painting his collar red. Joffrey's eyes were wide with disbelief and sudden terror. He choked, and his goblet fell from his hand. In that split second, Sansa released the handle and spun to face Tywin. The old lion's reflexes were frighteningly fast. He shot up from his seat, toppling his chair, but he seemed uncertain whether to run or call for guards. Lord Varys staggered back, hands raised in a gesture of shock or perhaps self-preservation. Sansa lunged across the table, seizing the goblet Joffrey had knocked over. With Joffrey gurgling behind her, she hurled the heavy cup at Tywin's face. It was not elegant, but it forced him to raise an arm to block it. In that instant, her hand darted to Joffrey's belt. The boy king sometimes wore a decorative dagger there. Her fingers found the hilt, slick with blood from Joffrey's wound, and she wrenched it free. She pivoted, now armed with the second blade, and sprang at Tywin like a hunting cat. He was still off balance, and she caught him in the side. A moment's hesitation slowed her. This was not as clean as she'd hoped. Tywin managed to grasp her wrist, forcing the blade upward. He was strong, far stronger than she expected for an older man, and he twisted her arm with surprising skill. Pain flared, and she feared her grip might fail. She saw, out of the corner of her eye, Joffrey slumping to the carpet, his eyes rolling back. Lord Varys stayed frozen in place, perhaps calculating his next move. She wrenched her arm free with a desperate effort, ripping the blade out of Tywin's side. She let out a low cry as she drove it forward again, determined to end it. This time, it found the hollow beneath his ribcage. Tywin's eyes opened wide, his lips parting in a silent gasp. She felt him grow heavier against her, as though his strength was fleeing all at once. He collapsed backward, eyes still locked on her face. For a moment, she thought she saw some strange flicker of recognition, as though he finally understood that Ned Stark's daughter was capable of savage retribution. His breath rattled in his throat. Blood seeped across the front of his tunic. She released the blade, leaving it embedded in his body. The solar was in chaos. Joffrey lay on the floor, blood pooling. Tywin was slumped in a twisted posture, struggling to breathe. Lord Varys stared at her, lips parted. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, no one spoke. Then came the crashing steps of Ser Meryn, presumably having dealt with whatever scuffle had occurred in the hall. He burst through the solar door, sword in hand. His eyes took in the scene, the king dying or perhaps already dead, and the hand of the king spitting blood from a mortal wound. Sansa stumbled away from Tywin, stepping behind the table to keep it between her and Ser Meryn. Varys too stepped back, as though to remove himself from the conflict. The guard's face contorted with rage. "You!" Sansa had no illusions of beating Ser Meryn in a fair fight. She looked for any escape. The door to the annex was behind her. She thought about running, but the night might reach her before she could vanish. She glanced at the wide window. If she could get there, no, it was too high a drop. She would break every bone in her body. But as Ser Meryn advanced, her back scraped the table. She felt something behind her, the heavy decanter of wine. With trembling hands, she snatched it and hurled it at Ser Meryn's face. He raised his sword arm to block, but the decanter smashed against his forearm, shards of glass and a flood of wine splashing over him. He cursed, momentarily blinded by the golden liquid and grappling with flying shards. She took that instant to dash toward the annex door. Varys made no move to stop her, which surprised her. He simply watched with wide eyes. Perhaps he was calculating the new balance of power or ensuring he was not seen abetting the crime. Sansa darted through the hidden door, pulling it shut behind her. She heard Ser Meryn's boots thunder across the floor. She latched the door from the inside, an old mechanism she'd spied earlier, though she doubted it would hold long. Her heart hammered as she slid between the shelves. Sprinting toward the exit, that led to the corridor beyond the library annex. She prayed it was empty. Luck, for once, was with her. She emerged into the hallway just as two startled servants came around the corner. They saw the blood on her gown, Joffrey's blood, Tywin's blood, and shrank back in horror, dropping their linens. She flung them aside and ran. She had no plan beyond that moment, no illusions that she could remain in the Red Keep. The alarm would be raised in seconds. She imagined gold cloaks flooding every corridor, searching every room. She thought of the Hound, of Cersei, of all those who would thirst for her blood. But Sansa ran, pushing past guards and servants alike, weaving through half-hidden passages whenever she could. Shouts echoed behind her. She was sure she was about to be cornered when she remembered a rumor about a secret gate in the southwestern tower, the one that overlooked Blackwater Bay. She had gleaned it from an overheard conversation about the Targaryens of old. If it still existed and was unguarded or locked with a simple mechanism, it might be her best hope. She forced herself to keep running, ignoring the stitch in her side. She tore off the blood-splattered overskirt, left in only a simpler shift to help her blend into the gloom. The clang of metal boots and shouting from the Lannister guards soared through the halls. She dashed down a spiral staircase, nearly slipping on the worn stone steps. A startled Lannister man-at-arms came at her with a spear. She slid under his initial thrust, the spear tip scoring a line across her shoulder. Pain flared, hot and bright, but adrenaline propelled her. She clutched his spear shaft, twisting it, and he lost balance for half a second. It was enough. She broke free and continued, ignoring the throbbing burn and the blood that trickled down her arm. She found the small courtyard she sought, half forgotten behind a cluster of old storerooms. Above, the southwestern tower loomed. She glimpsed a narrow door at its base. She pulled on the iron handle locked. Panting, she shoved harder. It wouldn't budge. Voices shouted behind her. She could almost feel the hounds snapping at her heels. She looked around, found a weather-worn stone bench. With all her might, she heaved it against the door. The rotted wood splintered near the lock. She slammed it again. A crack. Another. Finally, the lock gave way with a groan. She squeezed through into a dark stairwell. The dank smell of old sea air rushed at her. She knew if she went upward, she'd reach the ramparts, which were heavily patrolled. Downward, hopefully, might lead to the secret gate. She went down, every step lit only by the flickering torchlight from above. When she reached the lower level, she could hear water, a gentle lapping. A faint memory or rumor told her that in older days, Targaryen kings had built escape routes to the bay. Perhaps it was bricked up now. Perhaps she was going to hit a dead end and be trapped. She pressed on, ignoring her mind's anxious chatter. The corridor curved. The water's sound grew louder. Her eyes adjusted, revealing a patch of moonlight ahead. Then she saw it. A rusted iron gate, half collapsed, leading to a small stone ledge over Blackwater Bay. Beyond it, the water rippled under the moon. She hurried forward, hearing the echo of footsteps behind her. She realized the gate was locked. A chain looped through. She yanked on it, it didn't give. She was about to dash it with a rock when she heard a voice from behind. Sansa Stark. Little bird. Her blood froze. She recognized that rasping timbre. Sandor Clegane, the Hound, looming in the darkness. Half his face was in shadow, the other half scarred and monstrous even in the dim corridor. For a terrible moment, she thought her attempt to avenge her father would end here, in this damp tunnel, skewered by Joffrey's sworn shield. She forced herself not to retreat. She had nowhere to go anyway. He stared at her, and she realized he had no weapon in hand. His sword was sheathed. He took a step closer. She tried to keep her voice steady. If you've come to kill me, you should get on with it. Something flickered in his eyes. Pity? Or maybe admiration? He shook his head. You did it, didn't you? Killed the boy and the old lion. She tried to mask her trembling. I did. Her breath came ragged. They killed my father. The Hound nodded slowly, as if he understood everything in that single breath. He turned to the iron gate behind her. You'll die if you stay here, he said gruffly. She had no answer to that. A second passed. Then he moved past her, drew his sword, and in a single powerful motion hewed the chain. The lock snapped. He kicked the gate open, revealing the ledge beyond and the open water below. She realized he was letting her go. She stared at him in confusion. "Why?" she breathed, her voice barely audible above the distant crash of the water. He said nothing for a moment. Then, in a voice still rough but oddly gentle, he replied, "I'm sick of them all, girl. Lannisters, Starks, the lot. You did what I never had the guts to do. Now go before the nights swarm in." Sansa considered him. She remembered the times he had shown her a dark sort of kindness. She realized this was his final gift. She stepped onto the ledge, feeling the fresh night air on her face. The water was a perilous distance down. Could she swim? She glanced back at the hound. I don't know how to jump," she said, half hysterical. "I'll drown." He gave her a twisted grin. "Better drowned than flayed by Cersei. There's a fishing skiff below, moored near the rocks. The drop's not so far. Swim to it if you can, or die trying." Footsteps echoed from the passage behind him, shouts of more guards approaching. The hound took a stance by the open gate, blocking the corridor with his massive frame. "Go," he commanded. Sansa, tears streaming down her cheeks, nodded once. "Thank you," she whispered. She didn't wait for a response. There was no time. She took a breath, slipped through the iron gate, and clambered onto the narrow stone lip. The bay glimmered below, an ominous expanse of black water. She spared one last glance at Sandor Clegane. She thought she saw him draw his sword, ready to hold off the guards who would soon flood this place. Then, pressing her back to the stone, she inched outward until no more stone remained. Her heart thundered as she crouched. Then she pushed off. The plunge was terrifying, a rush of wind in her ears. The cold water slapped her like a hard hand. She went under, the salt stinging her eyes and mouth. Panic seized her limbs for a moment, but she forced herself to surface, sputtering and gasping. The waves tossed her. She flailed, searching for any sign of the fishing skiff the hound had mentioned. Then, by the faint moonlight, she saw a small boat bobbing near the rocky outcropping, maybe 20 yards away. She kicked and thrashed, half sinking with every wave, her dress weighing her down. But a primal will to survive drove her. Slowly, she made progress. Her arms burned, her lungs ached. She coughed up seawater again and again. Finally, her fingers brushed wood. She scrambled to haul herself up over the side, nearly overturning the skiff in the process. Collapsing into the boat, she lay there, panting, salt water streaming down her face. She half expected crossbow bolts to rain down from the walls, but the hush of night was broken only by distant shouting. She was free, or at least beyond the immediate grasp of the Lannisters. She realized with a shudder of disbelief that Joffrey Baratheon, so-called king, was gone. Tywin Lannister, the Hand, also gone. She had done it. The final memory of Tywin's gasp, Joffrey's wide, panicked eyes, roiled in her mind. Her arms, her gown, all painted with their blood. She tasted bile in her throat. "Pull yourself together," she commanded. "You cannot falter now." She reached for an oar, found that the skiff had only one. She gazed out across the black waters. The city's lights glowed behind her, flickering in the darkness like a malign constellation. She had no idea where to go. Perhaps she would drift until dawn. The city was behind her, though. King's Landing, the monster's den, was no longer the cage she was trapped in. She tried to row, trembling with fatigue. Every muscle ached. After some minutes, the current carried her further from the Red Keep into the broader stretch of Blackwater Bay. Perhaps she would find a larger ship, or maybe she would wash ashore somewhere along the coast if the tide was favorable. She didn't know, but she was alive, and she had fulfilled the vow she'd made when her father died. Night seemed endless. She spent hours out on the water, dozing fitfully between attempts at rowing. Pain stabbed her shoulder from the spear graze, and she suspected the wound might need tending soon. Blood mingled with the salt crusting her clothing. She told herself she would not die tonight, not after coming this far. At some point, when the moon was lower in the sky, she spotted a faint shadow of a vessel anchored further out, perhaps a merchant ship or a smuggler's craft. She decided to try her luck. Summoning the last of her strength, she rowed for it, hoping they might be kind, or at least not kill her on sight. It took an eternity, but eventually the hull loomed overhead, dark and menacing. She tried to call out, but her voice was ragged. She tapped the side of the boat with the oar. A lantern soon flickered over the rail. A pair of bearded men peered down at her. She saw confusion, then a flash of steel as one brandished a knife. "Halt there," he hissed. "Who goes?" She forced the words out. "Sansa, Stark. I need help." They exchanged glances, clearly uncertain. But something about her ravaged state or the name Stark made them hesitate. Another face appeared, an older man with a lined brow. They muttered among themselves. Finally, they lowered a rope ladder. Sansa gripped it, summoning every last ounce of strength to climb. She barely made it onto the deck before collapsing. Dimly, she registered one of them asking, "Gods, girl, what happened?" Another said, "7 hells, she's bleeding." They seemed a ragged bunch, not official merchants, but maybe not complete brigands either. She needed to remain calm, to keep her wits about her. Still, exhaustion and shock threatened to swallow her. She managed a croaking voice. "I need to leave King's Landing. I can pay." The older man with the lined brow knelt, looking at her critically. "Pay? Sansa fumbled at her skirts, remembering she had no coin, only a small piece of jewelry she'd managed to keep hidden. A silver ring that had once belonged to her mother. The man took it, examined it, and a glimmer of interest lit his eyes. "We might find value in this. And you? You say you're a Stark." He looked at her again, noticing her highborn bearing despite the blood and salt. "Well, if half the rumors about Robb Stark are true, he pays good coin for the return of his kin. Or if not, maybe someone else would." She felt a stab of alarm. They might ransom her, but perhaps that was better than being captured by the Lannisters. She nodded weakly, tears threatening. "Just not back to the Lannisters, please," she whispered. The man gave a short laugh. "There's news afloat, something about the king being stabbed in his own keep. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Sansa closed her eyes, refusing to speak. Her silence was enough of an answer. The men looked at each other, some startled, some intrigued. "Well," one said, "the realm'll be in chaos now. Best we weigh anchor and be off." The older man nodded. "We're heading south, maybe to Dorne's coast. If we can find a buyer for our cargo, we'll be in luck. The girl can come along. For a price, we'll keep her safe. Safer than she'd be alone in those waters anyway." Sansa felt a wave of relief, though tempered by the knowledge that she was at their mercy. At least she wouldn't be turned over to the Lannisters. Not yet. And if they indeed sought to ransom her to Robb, that might be a blessing. She would see her brother again, perhaps her mother too. For now, she lay back, letting them tend her wound. An older woman, presumably the ship's cook or caretaker, dabbed it with a pungent salve. Sansa winced, biting back cries of pain. She stayed awake long enough to watch the lights of King's Landing recede in the distance. Then a crushing exhaustion overcame her. Darkness descended upon her mind. When she woke, dawn was a smear of pink across the horizon. She blinked, adjusting to the gentle rocking of the ship. She was in a cramped cabin with a small porthole. She heard the splash of waves against the hull. Her dress had dried stiff with salt, and her shoulder throbbed. She rose slowly, feeling every bruise and cut. Despite her condition, she felt alive in a way she never had while imprisoned in the Red Keep. She had done the unthinkable. In one single, desperate strike, she had avenged her father, ridding the world of Joffrey Baratheon and Tywin Lannister. The consequences of her act were likely unfolding behind her in King's Landing, tangling the realm in new chaos. Her mother might despair upon hearing the news, fearing for Sansa's safety. Or perhaps word might never reach them in truth for some time. Maybe the Lannisters would claim some other story. She thought about Cersei. The queen would be frantic, consumed with rage. And Tyrion, he might attempt to hold the crumbling realm together in the aftermath. Littlefinger and Varys would scramble to adapt. But that was behind her now, at least for a time. Over the next few days, Sansa worked to regain her strength. She learned the names of some of the crew. The older man was called Bannon, the de facto captain of this motley vessel, which they called the Salty Maiden. He was cautious but not wholly cruel. He asked her about her family and how to best contact them for ransom. She provided him partial truths, leaving out the grisly details of her escape from the Red Keep. She told him that her brother, Robb Stark, was king in the north and that if they reached White Harbor, he might have men who could reward them. Bannon considered it. White Harbor's a long way from here, and not the direction we plan to sail, he said. But we'll see. For now, they continued south, intent on offloading contraband cargo in a hidden cove near Dorne. Sansa realized she had exchanged one uncertain captivity for another, but at least these men were not bent on vengeance against her. They saw her as an asset. If they were wise, they would treat her with care. But if things went poorly, she didn't like to think about that. On the third day at sea, the ship anchored off a small spit of land. The men went ashore to meet a contact. Sansa was left with only a skeleton crew, Bannon included. She spent time on deck, gazing at the horizon. She listened to gulls cry, smelled the salt air. These sensory details were so different from the perfumed horrors of King's Landing. She felt an odd pang. She had never thought her life would come to this, adrift on a smuggler's ship after murdering the king. She thought of Joffrey's face again, how his eyes bulged with terror. She wished she could feel triumphant, but she felt numb. She had done what she set out to do, but a piece of her soul felt irreparably changed. That evening, Bannon approached her with a cautious politeness. He offered her some stale bread and a piece of salted fish. "We'll be here for a night or two," he explained. "Best keep below deck. Don't want prying eyes from the shore." She nodded. "How's the shoulder?" he asked, not unkindly. She shrugged, wincing a bit. "Better," she managed. He eyed her for a moment, then lowered his voice. Words spreading through the region already. The king, Joffrey Baratheon, dead. Some say his uncle Tyrion did it. Others say it was a faceless man from Braavos. Still others claim Lord Varys orchestrated it. Nobody truly knows. Some rumor says Lord Tywin's dead as well. The city's in an uproar. Sansa nodded slowly. She wondered how long before word spread that Ned Stark's daughter had done the deed. Perhaps it never would. Maybe it would remain a rumor in the swirl of King's Landing gossip. That might be for the best. As Bannon walked away, Sansa looked up at the stars. She felt a tremor deep inside. Her faith. Arya's face drifted through her mind, along with Arya's, Bran's, and Rickon's. She longed to return to them, but that was a long road away. If indeed the crew decided to ransom her to Robb, that might be her best hope of seeing her family again. She clenched her fists, trying to summon the same fierce determination that had fueled her in the Red Keep. She had set out to avenge Ned Stark, and she had succeeded. Yet the cost had been enormous. Her innocence was gone, replaced by cold resolution. She told herself she would do it all again for her father. The men responsible for Ned Stark's death had deserved no mercy, and she had given them none. The next morning, she listened to the crew speak of fresh rumors. Cersei Lannister had reportedly declared a state of emergency in King's Landing. The small council was in disarray. The Tyrells, hearing of the chaos, might make a move. Stannis Baratheon would sense an opportunity. Rival factions would tear each other apart. Sansa realized that in killing Tywin and Joffrey, she had struck a blow that might unravel the Lannister hold on power entirely. Part of her felt satisfaction. Another part, the part that had been taught to be gentle and gracious, lamented the probable thousands who would die in the war to come. One of the younger crewmen, Tovies, sidled up to her as she stood at the rail. "Ever been to Dorne, my lady?" he asked, with a mocking emphasis on the courtesy. She shook her head. "It's a harsh land, They say, he continued, but full of passion and color, the sort of place to vanish if one wants to avoid trouble from the rest of Westeros. Perhaps you'll find a new life there. She gave him a guarded look. I have a family, she said softly. I must return to them. He shrugged. Maybe you will if your brother pays well. But if he doesn't, he trailed off, letting the threat hang. Sansa's jaw clenched, but she gave no reply. She simply turned away and went below deck. In the cramped cabin, she confronted her reflection again in a polished metal plate. The bruises had begun to fade, but a haunted look lingered in her eyes. She remembered the moment the blade sank into Joffrey's throat, and how her stomach had turned at the same time that relief had flooded her. She remembered Tywin's final ragged breath. She exhaled slowly. If she had to do it again, she would. There was a kind of strength in acknowledging that. She was no longer the Sansa who had dreamt of songs and gallant knights. She was something else. Someone who had faced darkness and made her choice. The days turned into a week. The salty maidens skirted the coast, traveling southward, sometimes anchoring in hidden coves to wait out patrol ships. Sansa gleaned that Bannon was wary of the chaos in King's Landing. He worried about Lannister warships patrolling the coast, searching for fleeing enemies. The news only grew more dire. The Lannisters had placed a heavy bounty on anyone with knowledge of the killers. Tyrion Lannister, ironically, had taken the position of the King's Hand, given that Tywin was gone, but the king was also gone, so rumor had it that Tommen was next in line, or maybe Myrcella. Nothing was certain. War threatened to intensify, with the Crown's hold on the Stormlands and the Reach in flux. Cersei was rumored to be half-mad with grief and rage, ordering mass arrests in the city. Sansa shuddered at the thought. All that anger directed at her, if only they knew. Or perhaps Cersei suspected. She might suspect the Hound's involvement or the Spiders. Sansa wondered if Sandor had escaped. She silently prayed the Lannisters had not cut him down. Amid all this uncertainty, Bannon eventually decided that ransoming Sansa back to Robb Stark was indeed his best chance for profit. He told her this plainly one morning while they ate a meager breakfast on deck. Taking you back up north is no small risk, he said. But if your brother is indeed crowned king in the north, he might pay handsomely to see you safe. I'll want gold or silver at least, enough to line every pocket of my crew. Then we'll part ways. Sansa nodded. Thank you, she said quietly. She felt relief and dread in equal measure. She would see Robb again, her family, but what would he think of what she had done? She was not certain how her mother would react, nor if it would change the war's shape. But she had precious little choice. She could not roam the seas indefinitely. The salty maiden pointed its prow north at last, hugging the coast at night, avoiding major ports. Their plan was to attempt landing near White Harbor. Perhaps they would find a way upriver from there, or maybe just send word to Robb that they had Ned Stark's daughter. Time passed slowly. Sansa spent her days alone, wrestling with nightmares and fleeting hopes. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw Joffrey's last breath. She jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, unsure if she was relieved or horrified. Sometimes in her dreams, Ned stood by her side and said nothing, only watched her with sad eyes. She wished she could know if he approved, or if he mourned her lost innocence. But the dead gave no answers. After nearly 2 weeks, they were far enough north that the air turned chill at night. Sansa stood at the bow, her wet hair whipping in the wind. She could see the coastline in the moonlight, dark and rocky. Bannon had said that they were near an estuary that led inland. We'll see if we can't slip up that river, he had said. But if we meet any of your brother's bannermen on patrol, you must speak for us. Sansa agreed. Now, as night deepened, she saw pinpoints of light on the shore. Fishermen's huts, perhaps. The wind had grown stronger, and the sea was choppy. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the stern. The lookout had spotted a ship's silhouette on the horizon. Alarm rippled through the crew. Was it a Lannister ship, or worse, an entire war fleet? A few tense minutes passed as they tried to steer into the mouth of the estuary. But the wind and current conspired against them, forcing them to move slower than they liked. The shape on the horizon drew closer. Lantern lights flickered along its decks. Sansa heard the ship's watchman curse. The unknown vessel was bigger, well-armed by the look of it. The Salty Maiden would be no match in a direct confrontation. The crew prepared for the worst, stowing valuables and cutting unnecessary weight. They dimmed their lanterns and tried to sail in silence, hugging the coastline in hopes of slipping away unnoticed. But the larger ship angled toward them, as if it had already caught sight of their silhouette. Panic set in. Bannon barked orders. They would row for the estuary, use the smaller boat if needed. Sansa stood near the mainmast, heart racing. If these were Lannister men, her life was forfeit. Yet she refused to cower. She found herself thinking, I have already faced Joffrey and Tywin. I will not die whimpering. The crew took to oars, pulling desperately for the mouth of the river. The wind gusted, pushing them slightly off course. Over her shoulder, Sansa watched the other ship's sails. Its design was not one she recognized from her days in King's Landing. The men aboard it might be pirates or Selsails or Baratheon loyalists. She had no way of knowing. The Salty Maiden's progress was excruciatingly slow. A handful of men had unsheathed weapons, though they could do little in a naval encounter. Then came a deep horn blast from the approaching vessel. A voice carried across the water, "Heave to! Identify yourselves!" Bannon cursed, ignoring the hail. Another horn blast. The bigger ship was closing in, its lanterns revealing the glint of armed men at the rails. Sansa could barely breathe. If it came to a boarding action, the Salty Maiden would be easily overwhelmed. She prayed for a miracle, scanning the black shoreline for a place to hide. The mouth of the estuary was just ahead, but it was narrow and rocky, dangerous to navigate at night. Out of options, Bannon steered the Salty Maiden into the jagged channel, hoping they could scrape through the shallow waters. The hull groaned as it dragged against submerged rocks. The men cursed, heaving on the oars. The larger ship held back momentarily, perhaps wary of running aground. This gave them a precious lead. The Salty Maiden slipped past the rocks into slightly calmer waters. They heard shouts from behind as the bigger vessel's crew tried to navigate the hazards. For a moment, it seemed they might escape. Sansa's heart soared with hope. But then the Salty Maiden's hull struck something that rocked the ship violently. A snap echoed across the deck, the rudder or a portion of the keel. Water poured in from a gash. The men scrambled to patch it, but it was too large. The ship began to list alarmingly to starboard. Bannon cursed, ordering them to abandon ship. The smaller boat was lowered, but the combined weight of the entire crew threatened to swamp it. Sansa had no choice but to climb in with the others as they frantically rowed deeper into the estuary. The Salty Maiden, her hull rent by rocks, started to sink behind them. A wave of sorrow and fear rushed over Sansa. It was her lifeline, for good or ill, and now it was gone. They rowed in silence, hearts pounding, hearing the shouts from the bigger ship's crew as they watched the smugglers sink. They might not dare navigate these rocks in the dark, so maybe that was a small mercy. For now, Sansa found herself crammed between Tovies and Bannon in the boat. The men rowed, searching for a safe place to land. The tide pulled them deeper inland, the current swirling with brackish water. They rowed until the sun threatened to rise, eventually reaching a more placid stretch of water. Then, exhausted and half-frozen, they pulled onto a muddy bank lined with reeds. Dawn broke over them, cold and gray. Sansa stepped out of the boat, her feet sinking into the wet mud. They were somewhere along a river that fed into the bay, with a narrow path leading into a wooded area. Bannon exhaled in relief. "We lost them," he said, though anxiety edged his voice. "But we lost the damned ship too. We'll have to move overland." The crew stared at each other, uncertain. Their cargo was gone. All they had left was what they could carry in the small boat. Sansa felt a pang of guilt, though she had no reason to think this was her fault. Bannon turned to her. "You'd best hope your brother's men find us before we starve." She nodded numbly. That was their only plan now. Try to travel north until they could make contact with northern bannermen. Sansa dreaded the unknown stretch of land between here and White Harbor. Raiders, brigands, Lannister patrols might be anywhere. They stashed the boat in the reeds and moved inland, forging a path through the trees. The forest was quiet, aside from birdsong and the rustle of leaves. The men brandished spears or the few swords they had. Sansa stayed near Bannon. She had no weapon, her dagger was lost, left behind in Tywin's chest. They marched for hours, the land rising into gentle hills. By midday, they paused to rest and eat the last of their provisions. The conversation was hushed, tension thick. One man wanted to turn south again. Another said they should keep going north for the ransom. Bannon insisted they press on, saying it was their best chance at a real payday. Sansa listened without comment. She was too weary, and her shoulder hurt anew from the jostling. She found a patch of grass to sit on, hugging her knees as she tried to quell her rising panic. She had left behind one desperate situation only to find another. They set out again, trudging north. Over the next few days, they moved slowly, sleeping in improvised camps, foraging for roots and small game. The men grew restless. Sansa felt their eyes on her. She was an asset, but also a burden. Tovies in particular seemed uneasy, as though weighing whether to cut losses. Bannon, to his credit, maintained control. On the third day of this overland trek, they encountered a small group of riders on the horizon. Alarm rippled through them. Were they Lannisters, or some other hostile force? They ducked behind a rise, waiting, only to discover that the riders bore a distinctive sigil, the Mermen of House Manderly. Sansa's heart soared. Bannon decided to wave them down, hoping to parley. The riders approached warily, but upon hearing Sansa's claim that she was a Stark, they demanded proof. She told them details only a true-born daughter of Ned Stark might know. She recited the name of the Master-at-Arms at Winterfell, described White Harbor's courtesies. The riders, after some hesitation, believed her enough to escort them under guard. This marked the beginning of the next chapter of Sansa's journey. The men of House Manderly took them to a small keep near the river, where the local lord was aligned with the Starks. There, Sansa bathed for the first time in weeks, scrubbing the grime of the Red Keep, the salt of the sea, and the mud of the wilderness from her skin. But not the memory of that day in Tywin's solar. Nothing could wash that away. She was given a plain gown that at least fit better than her ragged smuggler's clothes. Bannon and his crew were held in decent quarters, told they would be well compensated if indeed Sansa's story proved true. Ravens were sent out to confirm that this was truly Sansa Stark. If so, they would escort her to White Harbor, then hopefully onward to her family. Sansa felt like she was floating in a dream. She was safe for the moment, but the nightmares persisted, reminding her that blood had been spilled by her hand. Weeks passed in that keep. The local lord, Lord Locke, was kind enough, though he eyed Sansa with curiosity and some degree of awe. After all, if the rumors were true, she had slain the king in King's Landing. But she did not speak of that. She only said she had escaped the Lannisters. Word eventually came back. Robb Stark was, indeed, still king in the north, though his fortunes in the war shifted daily. He was near the twins, planning something with Walder Frey, according to the messages that arrived. Arrangements were made to send Sansa there under guard, to reunite her with her mother and brother. The men who had smuggled her would also go to receive payment. Sansa dreaded traveling again, but at least this time she would be surrounded by northern soldiers, men loyal to House Stark. When at last they set out, the roads were rough, the land scarred by war. They saw burned farms, peasants scrounging for survival. It made Sansa ill. She had come to realize that while her vengeance had toppled 2 Lannister pillars, it had also likely escalated the conflict. But she was only one person, a girl driven by grief. She wrestled with the guilt, trying to tell herself that, if not Joffrey, someone else would have fueled the war. Joffrey had shown no mercy to anyone. He would have continued butchering and tormenting. Tywin was the architect of countless atrocities. Still, the scale of suffering weighed on her heart. Riding north felt like stepping back into a world she had once known. The air grew colder, the forests thicker. The men of House Locke were stoic, but kind enough to share fireside conversation when they camped at night. Some spoke of longing for peace, for the days before the realm was torn apart. Sansa listened silently. She had once longed for songs and courtly love. Now she understood that the real world was shaped by blood and steel. On the 9th day of travel, they reached the outskirts of the Twins, where Walder Frey held his crossing on the Green Fork. Sansa's excitement to see her family grew, though tinged with a subtle dread. She had heard rumors that Robb intended to wed a Frey or had broken a promise. She did not know what reception awaited them here. They found that King Robb was indeed encamped near the Twins, though not inside them. Lord Locke's men took Sansa to the outskirts of Robb's camp. Snow flurries swirled in the air, unseasonably cold. Tents stretched for a league or more. Northern banners fluttered in the breeze. Dire wolves, flayed men of the Boltons, a sight that made her shiver. Mermen of Manderley, sunbursts of Karstark, and others. As they rode into the camp, soldiers paused to stare, murmuring. They recognized House Stark's daughter. Sansa's cheeks grew hot. She felt a sudden panic, unsure how to face her brother and mother after what she had done. But she could not turn back. At the heart of the camp stood a large pavilion ringed by Stark guards. Lord Locke dismounted, assisting Sansa down from her horse. Her legs shook from the long ride. The guards recognized her, eyes wide, and let her pass. Inside, she found Robb Stark standing over a table of maps, flanked by his bannermen. He looked older, wearier, but still every inch the young wolf. Auburn hair, a resolute face. At his side was Catelyn Stark, her mother, who wore an expression of deep worry that melted into shock at the sight of Sansa. "Sansa?" Catelyn gasped, stepping forward. Her face crumpled, tears springing forth. Sansa, trembling, fell into her mother's arms, burying her face in the familiar scent of wool and lavender. Robb stared in stunned disbelief, then broke into a tender smile. "Sansa!" He wrapped them both in a careful embrace, mindful not to crush them. The gathered men watched in respectful silence as the Stark family reunited. After a moment of tearful relief, Catelyn and Robb pulled back to examine Sansa, noticing her scarred shoulder and the haunted look in her eyes. Catelyn gently cupped her daughter's face. "What happened to you?" she whispered. Sansa found she couldn't form the words. It was too much, the swirl of memories and guilt. But she managed to choke out, "I'm safe now. Mother, she trailed off, tears burning her eyes. Robb dismissed his bannermen to give them privacy. Slowly, haltingly, Sansa recounted a sanitized version of her journey. Her imprisonment under the Lannisters, her eventual escape. She did not go into detail about the assassination. She only said that she had seized a chance to flee amidst chaos. But the rumor was already out there, and Catelyn's expression shifted to one of fearful realization. "My sweet girl," she said carefully, "there are those who say you were responsible for the king's death." Sansa drew a shaky breath. "He executed father," she said softly. I couldn't," she swallowed. "I did it for father." Catelyn looked away, tears glimmering. Robb's face hardened, a swirl of emotions crossing his features. He took Sansa's hand. "Joffrey was a monster," he said after a moment. "I only wish none of this had been necessary." Sansa lowered her head. She couldn't speak, her throat tight. She remembered the moment of the dagger's bite, the hot spill of blood. Robb squeezed her hand. "We will keep you safe, no matter what. I'm glad you're here with us, where you belong." The others present, bannermen, lords, likely realized the implications. The Lannister power structure was severely undermined. Tywin, their brilliant commander, was gone. Joffrey, their king, likewise. But King's Landing was still a seat of power, with Queen Regent Cersei and possibly Tommen as a puppet king. The war would roll on, but perhaps the Starks and their allies stood a better chance now. Still, Sansa could not escape the quiet fear that overshadowed her relief. She had spilled the blood of the king and the Hand. The Lannisters would never forgive or forget. Even if the realm believed it was Tyrion, or Varys, or some faceless assassin, Cersei would seek vengeance. That was certain. Sansa's life, and the lives of her family, would remain in jeopardy. For that moment, however, she was reunited with her mother and brother. They led her to a quieter corner of the pavilion, where a brazier burned warmly. She sipped hot broth, let its warmth chase away the chill in her bones. Robb dismissed the curious onlookers, stating that Sansa needed rest. Catelyn brushed Sansa's hair, humming softly as she had when Sansa was a child. Tears slipped down Sansa's cheeks unbidden. She clung to her mother's hand as though it were the only real thing in the world. Later, when the camp had settled into evening routines, Robb summoned her again to speak privately with him, Catelyn, and a few trusted advisors. He wanted details needed to confirm rumors. He also wanted to hear her account of Tywin's demise. With trembling words, she recounted how she had used the confusion, how she had stabbed Joffrey first, how Tywin had resisted. The men listening exchanged glances of shock and awe. Catelyn's face was drawn tight, eyes wet. Robb's lips thinned. When she finished, he reached out to grip her shoulder gently. "You are stronger than you know, Sansa," he said. "But gods be good. I wish you had never been forced into that position." She nodded, understanding. They spoke of next steps, of how the war might shift now. Perhaps with Tywin gone, the Lannister forces would lack their old discipline. Kevan Lannister might try to take control, or Tyrion. The Tyrells could be wooed away from the crown. Robb's advisors speculated, but none knew for sure. All Sansa knew was that she was with her family again. The rest would unfold, for better or worse. That night, a quietness settled over the camp. Sansa lay in a tent with her mother, who refused to let her sleep alone. She was grateful for Catelyn's warmth, for the gentle hush of her mother's breath. She closed her eyes, drifting into a fitful doze. She dreamed of a lone direwolf prowling through a dark forest, its fur matted with blood. It lifted its head to the moon and howled, the sound echoing in endless night. When she woke, tears stained her cheeks. But her mother's arm was around her, a reminder she was not alone. The days that followed were a whirlwind of war councils and tidings from across the realm. Sansa did not attend all of them. She spent time simply resting, recovering from her ordeal. But whenever she stepped outside, men looked at her with respect or fear. They whispered that she had killed a king, that she was a vengeful wolf in maiden's clothing. The stories grew taller. Some said she slew half the Kingsguard single-handedly. Others claimed she used witchcraft. She tried to ignore the rumors, yet she sensed that her role in the war's tapestry had grown more important. She had not meant to become some avenging specter. She had only sought to avenge her father. On the fourth day, a raven arrived bearing a message from King's Landing. It bore the royal seal, Tommen Baratheon, though likely written by Cersei or the Small Council. It demanded the return of the assassin Sansa Stark, threatening dire consequences for any lord or lady who sheltered her. Robb read it aloud in the presence of his mother, Sansa, and several bannermen. When he finished, he merely folded it neatly. He turned to Sansa, meeting her eyes. "Cersei's lost her son and her father. She will never stop hunting you," he said gravely. Sansa nodded, heart heavy. "I know." Catelyn's voice trembled with anger. "They slaughtered Ned. They have no right to demand anything of us. We will never hand you over." Robb agreed. The bannermen muttered about the gall of the Lannisters. They decided to send a curt reply rejecting the demand, reaffirming the North's independence, and blaming the Lannisters themselves for their downfall. Sansa felt a pang of apprehension, knowing this would only further inflame hostilities. But she also felt a quiet pride. Her family stood with her. Time marched on. The Stark host prepared to move from the twins, forging new alliances. Some among Robb's circle suggested using Sansa's boldness as a rallying cry, proclaiming the Lannisters weaker than ever. Sansa herself did not relish being a figurehead of vengeance, but if it helped Robb's cause, she would not refuse. She was changed, after all. No longer the naive girl who once pinned her hopes on Joffrey's affection. She was, in some sense, a symbol of Lannister arrogance overturned. Late one evening, as she wandered near the river, she found Robb sitting on a log by the water's edge. He glanced up, beckoning her over. They sat together in silence for a while, listening to the quiet ripple of water. Finally, he spoke. "When Father died, I swore I'd avenge him," Robb said softly. "It looks like you did so first." There was no anger in his voice, only sorrow and a faint note of admiration. Sansa wrapped her arms around her knees. "I did what I had to," she whispered, voice quavering. "I still see it in my dreams." Robb nodded, eyes distant. "Me too. I see Father's head on the spike." Joffrey laughing. His jaw tightened. Then he looked at her, the flicker of torchlight illuminating his face. "He can't hurt anyone ever again, thanks to you." She managed a small, sad smile. She did not feel triumphant, only relieved that her father's killer was gone. They sat there for a long while, siblings bound by grief and the burdens of a war that had shaped them both. Sansa knew that there was no returning to who she once was, but she also knew that she was a Stark of Winterfell. She was surrounded by her family, or what remained of it. That would have to be enough for now. In the days ahead, she would don armor of courtesy once more, presenting a poised face to the lords and knights who flocked to Robb's banner. She would practice her needlework and smile when expected, but the steel in her heart remained. She had struck down Joffrey Baratheon and Tywin Lannister in one daring, desperate act. Though it weighed upon her soul, it also granted her a strange strength. The realm might burn with the fury of new conflicts, but no matter what happened, she had kept her father's memory alive by ensuring those who wronged him paid a dear price. She hoped, perhaps naively, that her final memory of Ned Stark would be tempered by the knowledge that she had not stood idly by, that in her own way, she had shown the world what a daughter of the North was capable of. Even if that knowledge chilled her at times, she carried it as a shield against the chaos of the realm. She was Sansa Stark, and she had a part to play in the story of wars and kings. The songs would not say she was a shrinking violet. They might call her a wolf in silk, a viper in a maiden's skin. Let them whisper their gossip. She knew the truth of who she was now. If the Lannisters came for her again, she would be ready, and this time she would not be alone. She turned her gaze northward, thinking of Winterfell and the ancient Godswoods. One day, she vowed, she would return there. She might kneel at the Heart Tree, speak to the old gods about all she had seen and done. If they judged her, let them. She would not shrink from it. She had walked through fire and darkness to avenge her father, and she had emerged both stained and stronger for it. That was the path she had chosen, and there was no going back. In the distant sky, clouds gathered, promising another storm. The world was roiled by war, shaped by the choices made in thrones and small council chambers, in shadows and secret passages. Sansa Stark had learned to navigate that darkness. She clenched her fists at her sides and breathed in the cold northern wind. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, but she would meet them head-on. She had already proven she was capable of the unthinkable. Now, perhaps she could discover if she was capable of rebuilding herself, her family, her legacy. She exhaled, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. Yes, tomorrow would come, and she would face it as a Stark. Vengeance had been served. Now she would seek whatever future remained, holding her head high in the knowledge that she had honored the memory of Ned Stark in the only way left to her, by being a wolf unleashed upon those who had tormented her family. And whether the realm knew it or not, they would never again make the mistake of underestimating Sansa Stark.